A black man is pulled over by the police while driving a luxury car, accused of theft, but the officers discover he is a renowned judge and the car is his. Marcus Silva was a man who had climbed the ladder of success with determination and grit. As a prominent judge, his name commanded respect in legal circles, and his reputation for fairness was well known. Marcus had come a long way from his humble beginnings, where he had to fight against every stereotype and barrier that society placed in his path. He was a symbol of perseverance, someone who had not just survived, but thrived in a world that often tried to hold him back. On this particular evening, Marcus had spent a long day in court, dealing with complex cases that required all of his attention and wisdom. As he left the courthouse, he felt the need to unwind. He decided to take his luxury car, a reward he had given himself after years of hard work, out for a drive. This car wasn't just a vehicle to him, it was a symbol of his achievements, a reminder of the barriers he had broken through to reach where he was. The car glided smoothly through the streets of the city, its engine humming quietly as Marcus navigated familiar roads. He chose to drive through his old neighborhood, a place that held memories of his childhood. The streets had changed since he was a boy, but they still bore the marks of his early struggles and dreams. As he passed by, he felt a sense of pride, knowing how far he had come from those days of uncertainty and struggle. But as Marcus continued to drive, he noticed something unusual, a police car trailing behind him. At first, he didn't think much of it. After all, he was simply enjoying an evening drive, and there was nothing to be concerned about. Yet, as the police car continued to follow him, a sense of unease began to creep in. He wondered if they might be following him for some reason. A few moments later, the police car's lights flashed, and Marcus heard the siren. They were signaling for him to pull over. Confused but still calm, Marcus complied, steering his car to the side of the road. He rolled down his window, expecting a routine check, perhaps a simple misunderstanding that would be quickly resolved. As the officers approached his car, Marcus could see their expressions, suspicion and hostility. They demanded to see his license and registration, their tone harsh and accusatory. Marcus handed over the documents without hesitation, explaining that he was a judge and that the car was his. But the officers didn't seem to believe him. They looked at him with disbelief, as if the idea of a black man owning such a car was beyond their comprehension. The officers asked Marcus to step out of the car. Though he felt a pang of indignation, Marcus complied, still holding on to the hope that this would all be over soon. But as he stood by the side of the road, the situation only worsened. The officers began searching his car, looking for any sign that could confirm their preconceived notions. Marcus could feel the weight of the injustice pressing down on him. Here he was, a man who had dedicated his life to upholding the law, being treated like a common criminal simply because of the color of his skin. Despite his calm demeanor, anger and frustration simmered beneath the surface. How could this be happening to him? Even after all he had achieved, he was still not free from the chains of prejudice. As Marcus stood by the side of the road, watching the officers rummage through his car, a sense of disbelief began to settle in. He had always known that being a black man in America came with its own set of challenges, but he had never imagined that even as a judge, he would be subjected to this kind of treatment. The officers showed no regard for his explanations or his credentials. They were fixated on the idea that a black man driving a luxury car must be doing something illegal. One of the officers, a tall man with a stern expression, approached Marcus with a set of handcuffs in his hands. Without any clear explanation, the officer roughly pulled Marcus's arms behind his back and placed the cuffs on him. The cold metal around his wrists sent a wave of humiliation through Marcus. He tried to maintain his composure, but the reality of the situation was deeply unsettling. "This car doesn't belong to you, does it?" the officer asked, his tone dripping with skepticism. Marcus, still maintaining his calm, replied, "It does. I bought it with my own money, earned from years of hard work." But the officer didn't seem to hear him. Instead, he continued to search the car, rifling through Marcus's personal belongings. Marcus could see the disdain in the officer's eyes, the way he looked at him as if he were nothing more than a suspect, guilty until proven innocent. Meanwhile, another officer was busy running Marcus's license plate and identification through the system. Marcus knew that the moment they saw his name and position, they would realize their mistake. But the humiliation of being treated this way, of being handcuffed and accused in front of bystanders who had begun to gather, was something he would never forget. As the search continued, Marcus felt the eyes of the onlookers on him. Some were recording the incident with their phones, while others whispered among themselves. None of them seemed to recognize him as the respected judge he was. To them, he was just another black man in trouble with the law. The officer who had cuffed Marcus began to make snide remarks, questioning how someone like him could afford such an expensive car. "How did you manage to get this car, huh? Steal it from someone?" the officer sneered. Marcus's patience was wearing thin, but he knew that reacting angrily would only make the situation worse. "I'm a judge," he said firmly. "This car is mine, and you're making a serious mistake." The officer laughed, clearly not believing a word. "A judge? That's a good one. What's next? You're going to tell me you're the president?" Before Marcus could respond, the officer who had been running his information approached with a puzzled look on his face. He glanced at the screen of his handheld device, then back at Marcus. We've got a problem," he muttered to the others. The officers exchanged uneasy glances as they huddled together, discussing what they had found. Marcus knew that the truth had finally come to light. They had discovered who he really was. The realization of their mistake was slowly dawning on them, and the arrogance that had fueled their actions was beginning to fade. After what felt like an eternity, the officers returned to Marcus, their demeanor noticeably different. The cuffs were quickly removed, and they stammered out apologies, explaining that it had all been a misunderstanding. Marcus could see the fear in their eyes, the fear of the consequences that might follow now that they knew his true identity. But despite their apologies, the damage had been done. Marcus stood there, free of the cuffs, but not free of the weight of what had just occurred. He knew that this incident was not just about him. It was a reflection of a deeper, systemic problem that affected countless others like him. And as he got back into his car, he made a silent vow to ensure that justice would be served, not just for himself, but for all those who had been wronged in similar ways. As Marcus sat back in his car, the sense of relief he should have felt was overshadowed by anger and frustration. The officers, now visibly uneasy, stood by awkwardly, offering half-hearted apologies. They knew they had made a serious mistake, but their attempts to make amends felt hollow and insincere. "Judge Silva, we're really sorry about this," one of the officers stammered, his voice lacking the confidence it had carried just moments earlier. "It was a mistake. We didn't realize who you were." Marcus took a deep breath, forcing himself to remain calm. He knew that his reaction now would be crucial. If he let his anger take control, it would only confirm the stereotypes they held about men like him. Instead, he looked directly at the officer who had cuffed him. "The problem isn't that you didn't know who I am," Marcus said, his voice steady. "The problem is that you assumed I was guilty because of the color of my skin." The officer's face flushed with embarrassment, but he said nothing in response. Marcus could see the other officers shifting uncomfortably, realizing the gravity of the situation they had created. They had targeted him based on their biases, and now they were faced with the consequences of their actions. Marcus turned his gaze to the bystanders who were still watching the scene unfold. Some of them had stopped recording, but others kept their phones trained on the officers, capturing every moment. He knew that this incident would likely spread across social media, and while part of him welcomed the attention it would bring to the issue, another part of him wished for the quiet dignity that he had fought so hard to maintain throughout his career. The officer in charge, trying to salvage the situation, spoke up. "Judge Silva, if there's anything we can do to make this right, please let us know." Marcus considered his options. He could simply drive away and let the incident be forgotten. Another example of the everyday injustices faced by black men in America. But that wasn't who he was. He had spent his life fighting for justice, and he wasn't about to let this moment pass without making a statement. "You can start by acknowledging that this wasn't just a mistake," Marcus said firmly. It was a reflection of the prejudice that too many people in this country still hold. I expect you to report this incident to your superiors and ensure that something like this doesn't happen again." The officer nodded, clearly eager to put the incident behind him. "We will, Judge. We'll make sure it's addressed." Marcus didn't need to say anything more. He had made his point, and he knew that the officers would think twice before making such assumptions again. But as he started his car and prepared to drive away, he couldn't shake the feeling of injustice that lingered. He knew that this was just one incident among many, and that there were countless others who had experienced similar situations without the power or influence to demand accountability. As he drove away, Marcus made a silent vow to use his position to bring about real change. He would ensure that this wasn't just another story that faded into the background, but a catalyst for a broader conversation about race, justice, and equality in America. Marcus's mind was already at work, planning the next steps he would take to address the systemic issues that allowed such incidents to happen. He would speak out, not just as a judge, but as a Black man who had faced the harsh realities of prejudice. And in doing so, he hoped to make a difference, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been judged by the color of their skin, rather than the content of their character. Driving away from the scene, Marcus couldn't escape the heaviness in his chest. The anger and frustration from the encounter still simmered beneath his composed exterior. The experience had been a stark reminder that, despite his achievements, he was not immune to the systemic racism that plagued society. The reality that his life could be so easily disrupted by prejudiced assumptions made him question how far society had truly come. As Marcus continued down the road, he reflected on the irony of the situation. Here he was, a judge, someone who had dedicated his life to upholding the law, being treated as a suspect simply because of his race. The encounter was a painful reminder that no amount of success could shield him from the biases deeply ingrained in the system. The thought of how different the outcome could have been if he weren't a judge, if he didn't have the resources and influence to demand accountability, weighed heavily on him. His phone rang, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was his wife, Simone, who had sensed something was wrong even before he answered. "Marcus, are you okay?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. Marcus hesitated for a moment, then sighed. "I'm fine now, but something happened. I was pulled over by the police. They thought I stole my own car." Simone's sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line was enough to tell him that she understood the gravity of what he had just experienced. "Are you all right? Did they hurt you?" "No, they didn't. But it was humiliating, Simone. They handcuffed me in front of everyone. They didn't even bother to listen when I told them who I was. It's as if none of that mattered." Simone was silent for a moment, processing what he had told her. "This isn't right, Marcus. You need to do something about this." "I will," he replied, his resolve hardening. "This isn't just about me. It's about every person who's ever been treated like a criminal because of their skin color. I can't just let this go." Simone's voice softened, filled with a quiet strength. "I know you'll do what's right. Just know that I'm here for you, whatever you decide to do." They talked for a while longer, discussing how Marcus could use his position to bring attention to the issue. By the time they hung up, Marcus had made up his mind. He would not let this incident be just another moment of personal indignity. He would turn it into a platform to challenge the systemic racism that allowed such encounters to happen in the first place. Over the next few days, Marcus began laying the groundwork for his plan. He reached out to colleagues, community leaders, and activists, all of whom were eager to support his cause. He knew that it wouldn't be easy. Change never was, but he was determined to see it through. He would push for policy reforms, greater accountability for law enforcement, and increased awareness of racial bias. Marcus was committed to making sure that what had happened to him wouldn't happen to someone else, or at the very least, that the next person who faced such prejudice would have the tools to fight back. As the days turned into weeks, Marcus's efforts began to gain momentum. He spoke at public forums, gave interviews to the media, and used every platform available to highlight the need for change. His story resonated with many, not just because of his position as a judge, but because it reflected the lived experiences of so many others. Marcus knew that this was just the beginning of a long battle, but he was ready for it. This experience had reignited a fire in him, one that burned not just for justice, but for equality. Marcus was determined to be more than just a judge who ruled from the bench. He would be an advocate for those who couldn't advocate for themselves, a voice for those who had been silenced by the weight of systemic racism. And as he continued his fight, he knew that the road ahead would be difficult, but it was a road he was ready and willing to travel. In the days that followed, Marcus threw himself into his work with renewed purpose. The incident with the police had not only shaken him, but had also ignited a determination to bring about meaningful change. He knew that his experience was just one of many, and that there were countless others who had faced similar, if not worse, situations without the power or influence to fight back. Marcus began reaching out to his network, starting with other judges and legal professionals who had a stake in the justice system. He shared his story openly, not just as a cautionary tale, but as a call to action. The response was overwhelming. Many of his colleagues, particularly those from marginalized communities, had their own stories of racial profiling and discrimination. They too were eager to see reforms that would address these deep-seated issues. Together, they began drafting proposals aimed at increasing accountability within law enforcement. Marcus knew that it wasn't enough to simply highlight the problem. They needed concrete solutions. The proposals focused on mandatory bias training for police officers, stricter oversight of police conduct, and the establishment of independent review boards to handle cases of misconduct. Marcus also advocated for better community policing practices that would build trust between law enforcement and the communities they served. As the proposals took shape, Marcus made sure to include the voices of those who had been directly impacted by racial profiling and police brutality. He reached out to community leaders, activists, and victims' families, listening to their experiences and incorporating their ideas into the reforms. It was crucial to him that this wasn't just a top-down initiative. It needed to be a movement driven by the people it was meant to protect. The media quickly picked up on Marcus's efforts. His story, combined with his status as a respected judge, made for a compelling narrative. Interviews and articles began appearing in major publications, shining a spotlight on the systemic racism within the justice system. Marcus used every opportunity to advocate for the reforms, emphasizing that this was not just a Black issue, but a human rights issue. He spoke passionately about the need for a justice system that truly lived up to its name, one that treated everyone equally regardless of their race or background. However, not everyone was supportive of Marcus's efforts. There were those who resisted the idea of reform, viewing it as an attack on law enforcement. Marcus received backlash from some quarters, with critics accusing him of being anti-police or undermining the authority of law enforcement. But he stood firm, knowing that real change was never easy and that he was on the right side of history. The pushback only strengthened his resolve. Marcus knew that the road to justice was fraught with obstacles, but he was prepared to face them head-on. He continued to speak out, refusing to be silenced or intimidated. His message was clear. The justice system needed to change, and that change had to start with acknowledging the racial biases that permeated it. As the movement gained momentum, Marcus began to see signs of progress. Some of the proposals he and his colleagues had drafted were being considered by lawmakers, and discussions about police reform were becoming more prominent in public discourse. It was a small but significant step in the right direction. Throughout it all, Marcus remained focused on the bigger picture. He knew that real, lasting change wouldn't happen overnight, but he was committed to seeing it through. The incident with the police had been a painful reminder of the work that still needed to be done, but it had also given him a renewed sense of purpose. Marcus was determined to make sure that his experience and the experiences of so many others would lead to a justice system that was truly just for all. As Marcus's campaign for justice and reform continued, he began to see tangible changes in the community. His advocacy had sparked conversations at local and national levels, and while progress was slow, the impact of his efforts was undeniable. He was invited to speak at conferences and panel discussions where he shared his story and the need for comprehensive reforms in law enforcement. Despite the growing support, Marcus faced ongoing challenges. Opponents of reform, including some law enforcement officials and political figures, continued to push back. They argued that the proposed changes would undermine police authority and make it harder for officers to do their jobs. This resistance was not only frustrating, but also disheartening, as it sometimes felt like an uphill battle. Nevertheless, Marcus remained undeterred. He used these opportunities to clarify his position and address misconceptions. During one heated debate, he addressed the concerns of critics directly. "This isn't about being against the police," he said firmly. "It's about being for justice and equality. Our goal is to ensure that every individual, regardless of their background, is treated fairly and respectfully. Reform isn't a threat to law enforcement. It's a step toward a more just and effective system." Marcus's insistence on dialogue and understanding helped him gain allies from unexpected places. Some law enforcement officers and officials, initially skeptical, began to see the merit in his arguments. They started advocating for the reforms within their own departments and expressed willingness to participate in bias training and oversight initiatives. Community support for Marcus's efforts continued to grow. Grassroots organizations, civil rights groups, and everyday citizens rallied behind his cause. They organized marches, petitions, and public forums to push for the proposed reforms. The momentum was building, and it was clear that the public was eager for change. Amidst this activity, Marcus faced personal and professional challenges as well. The scrutiny he was under due to his high-profile advocacy meant that his every move was watched and sometimes criticized. Despite the stress, he remained focused on his mission. His support system, including his family and close friends, provided him with the strength and encouragement he needed to persevere. As the campaign gained traction, Marcus worked tirelessly to ensure that the reforms would have a lasting impact. He collaborated with lawmakers to draft legislation based on his proposals and worked with community leaders to build coalitions that would support the implementation of the reforms. His efforts were aimed at creating a framework that would not only address immediate concerns, but also foster long-term improvements in the justice system. One of the key achievements of this period was the establishment of a new oversight committee designed to handle complaints of police misconduct. This committee was composed of representatives from various community groups, legal experts, and law enforcement officials. Its mission was to provide transparent investigations and hold officers accountable for their actions. Marcus's work also led to the creation of mandatory training programs focused on bias and cultural sensitivity for police officers. These programs aim to educate officers about the impact of their actions and help them understand the communities they served better. While these were significant steps forward, Marcus knew that the real challenge lay in sustaining the momentum and ensuring that the changes would be effectively implemented. He continued to engage with the community, monitor progress, and hold both law enforcement and lawmakers accountable. His commitment to this cause remained unwavering, driven by the belief that every person deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. The journey was far from over, but Marcus felt a deep sense of purpose and accomplishment. The challenges he faced had only strengthened his resolve, and he remained dedicated to seeing his vision of a just and equitable society come to fruition. As he looked to the future, Marcus was determined to continue advocating for the changes that would make a real difference, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been wronged by a flawed system. Months passed, and the reforms Marcus had fought so hard for began to show signs of making a real impact. The new oversight committee was functioning, and its investigations into police misconduct were starting to yield results. Complaints that might have been dismissed or ignored were now being taken seriously, and officers were being held accountable for their actions. The bias training programs were also in full swing. Marcus visited several police departments to observe the training sessions firsthand. The sessions were designed to challenge preconceived notions and help officers understand the communities they served. Many officers reported that the training had opened their eyes to the systemic issues they had previously overlooked. Marcus was encouraged by these developments, but remained vigilant, knowing that change required continuous effort. Despite these positive developments, the journey was far from complete. Resistance persisted, especially from those who felt threatened by the changes. Some argued that the reforms would compromise public safety and hinder effective policing. Marcus and his allies continued to address these concerns head-on, emphasizing that the goal was not to undermine law enforcement, but to create a more just and equitable system for everyone. Marcus also focused on maintaining open lines of communication between law enforcement and the community. He organized town hall meetings where citizens could voice their concerns and interact directly with police officers. These meetings were instrumental in rebuilding trust and fostering a dialogue between the two groups. It was evident that progress was being made, but the road ahead was still filled with obstacles. One of the significant challenges was ensuring that the new policies and training programs were consistently applied across different jurisdictions. Marcus worked closely with local leaders and law enforcement agencies to monitor implementation and address any issues that arose. He understood that for the reforms to be truly effective, they needed to be applied uniformly and embraced by all levels of the justice system. Amidst the ongoing work, Marcus took time to reflect on his journey. He thought about the initial encounter with the police, the personal and professional challenges he had faced, and the unwavering support from his family and community. It was a humbling experience to see how his efforts had sparked a broader movement for change. Simone remained a constant source of support, offering encouragement and understanding through the ups and downs. Their relationship had grown stronger as they navigated the complexities of Marcus's advocacy together. She often reminded him of the impact he was making and the lives he was touching, which helped him stay focused on his mission. The media continued to cover Marcus's efforts, and his story became a symbol of hope and resilience for many. He was frequently invited to speak at conferences and forums, sharing his experiences and advocating for further reforms. His work inspired others to join the fight for justice, and he was proud to see a growing network of individuals and organizations committed to making a difference. As Marcus looked to the future, he remained hopeful. He knew that the changes he had worked for were just the beginning. The real challenge was ensuring that these changes were sustained and expanded upon. He was determined to keep pushing for progress, knowing that every step forward, no matter how small, was a victory for justice. Marcus continued to be an active participant in the ongoing dialogue about race, justice, and reform. He believed that by staying engaged and committed, he could help drive the momentum needed to create a more equitable society. His journey was far from over, but he faced the future with renewed optimism and a steadfast dedication to the cause. The work that Marcus had begun was a testament to his belief in the power of change and the importance of fighting for what was right. His legacy would be one of courage, resilience, and an unwavering commitment to justice for all.